Okay.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the Humanities Teaching app, and we are oh so close to having version 2.0 ready to go public. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Jonathan Cook. We're going to be doing another discussion concerning Melville. We're going to be talking about his book, Typee. It's been about three and a half weeks since I read this book, so I'm going to need to have my memory jogged as we talk about this. But I do remember, because I was doing so much traveling when I was listening to it, how much I enjoyed it, because I was going through so many Native American communities, both up in Ohio and down south, and it made me see, I guess, indigenous people with new eyes. And I know we're talking about different sets of indigenous peoples in this book, but I think maybe it can be helpful for understanding American history in some respect. Is that a wrong conclusion to make?
No, I mean, Melville was a follower of Cooper. I mean, he read all of Cooper. His uncle, Melville's uncle, actually knew Cooper. His Peter Gansevoort, I think, overlapped with him at one point around Albany. So Melville was writing in the genre of white and European interaction with native peoples, and it just so happened that these were Polynesians and not Iroquois or Mohawk.
Right.
So, and it's true that, you know, some people look at Typee and what they see is a captivity narrative, which is a tried and true genre in American history, you know, with Mary Rowlandson in the 17th century, and I think it was later 17th. So he is pretty much very much in the genre of dealing with native peoples from American history, and you know, the Puritan settlement and the moving frontier and all that. I mean, that was the central issue of 19th century, 18th century, early 19th century American history. So he's just extending it to the frontier of the Pacific, which is where America was moving at this point.
I have to plead ignorance, and I'm sure there are other individuals who could be helped out if you could make this clarification. Who was Cooper?
Well, James Fenimore Cooper, you know, Leatherstocking novels, Last of the Mohicans, Pioneers, The Pathfinder, The Deerslayer. I mean, he was the big action novelist of the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. He died in 1851.
All right, I have much to catch up on.
So he's the American, considered the equivalent of Walter Scott, Sir Walter Scott. You know, who's writing about narratives of friction between English and Scottish peoples and various other parts of the world. So Cooper is imitating Scott. Melville's, to some extent, imitating Cooper, but on a very different level. But it made me think of Last of the Mohicans, the action-packed escape scene at the end of the book, and the Indian warfare scenes, and some of Cooper's books recall some of the action in Typee, although that's not really what we remember most about the book.
Right. Well, so like I do with so many of our other conversations about Melville texts, I mean, can you tell us a little bit about how this book came to be?
Yeah. Okay, so Melville, he himself had spent time in Polynesia. He shipped out in January 1841, and then in 1842 his ship arrived in the harbor outside the Marquesas Islands that he describes in Typee. And so, I mean, we should talk about this more. So he spent time on the island. We don't know exactly if he was with the Typee tribe. I mean, we don't have any kind of affidavit saying that that's exactly what happened. But he spent about a month somewhere with a native tribe on the Marquesa, you know, one of the Marquesa Islands. And then he left. He got back to America in October 1844, and he had told his story to a lot of people on board ship, and then he told his family, and they said, "Oh yeah, you should write this down because this is a great story about your quote unquote captivity amongst these native peoples." So, and including the escape with from the whale ship with Toby, who was an actual friend of Melville's, a shipmate. So Melville sat down and wrote out a narrative of his experience that ended up as the so-called novel of Typee, but he was really writing a memoir, and he was doing it both in New York City, staying with his brothers. He had two brothers who were lawyers in New York at this point. His brother Gansevoort, older brother Gansevoort, and his younger brother Alan. And but his mother and his sisters were living up in Lansingburg, New York, which is now part of Troy, New York. It's North Troy. So he was going back and forth. I'm not sure. I think he wrote probably half and half between Lansingburg and New York City. And so by the spring of 1845, he had a manuscript that he gave to his brother Gansevoort, who had been appointed as the secretary to the American legation in London, right? His brother was going over because James K. Polk had won the election in 1844. Mm-hmm. And Melville's brother helped elect Polk by giving a bunch of speeches in New York and elsewhere. And so Melville's brother took the manuscript to London, and he shopped it around, and he got Washington Irving to read it, and Irving recommended it. And so he ended up with the publisher of Murray, which is a well-known, well-respected publisher of literature. But the book was accepted in a series of travel narratives. So the book was really marketed and published as a travel book.
Right.
Not as a novel, not as a work of literature, but as a factual account of an experience in the Pacific by an American. And so the book was originally launched as a travel narrative, and of course it was one of many travel narratives in the list that Murray had, and so it was picked up in New York by Wiley and Putnam in a new series of books edited by a guy named Everett Dyking. So he was launched not as a novelist, but as a travel writer. And this was a popular genre at the time. There were a few people who were making a good living writing travel narratives.
Well, this raises so many interesting questions, right?
Yeah.
And I don't mean to cut you off, but like it's just the questions that are screaming in my brain right now is, we've got this synchronization of fact and fiction, right?
Yeah.
Like some of a lot of this stuff has like real life correlates, right? That Melville experienced while he was in residence.
Yeah.
But then other of it is, going to be exaggerations, maybe fabrications. So I guess in your learned scholarly opinion, and maybe you want to give a little bit more background information, but what percentage do you put at what, right? How much is true? How much is fiction? We have this synchronization, right? It's not, it may have been marketed as a travel narrative, right? As being an autobiography.
Yeah.
What are we dealing with if it's going in and out of reality,
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. I mean, we only think of it, it really is not a novel. It is a narrative. The only reason we think of it as a novel is because the word novel has become pretty flexible, and because everything that Melville wrote later was pretty much straight fiction, or more fictionalized. He his next book, Omu, had more of the traditional features of a novel because it had a certain development. It was more of a picaresque frame, a narrative with traditional novelistic characters. But Typee is really as much a work of anthropology and as anything else, because it's really a study of a tribe and their customs, and it just so happens that it begins and ends with, you know, sort of adventure to surround what is at its heart a study of a, you know, a native culture that really tries to say, you know, go from A to Z about all of its customs.
Do anthropologists take it as a serious account, given the fact that there are elements of the narrative that could be fictionalized?
I don't really know much about that. I'm not aware of any anthropologists. I mean, I think it's an item of curiosity for a lot of people, for its sort of pioneering objectivity and openness to, you know, understanding native cultures, because I mean, so many of the people interacting with Polynesians or Chinese at this point were evangelical missionaries who were not open to really understanding the culture. They wanted to convert these people and to sort of make them into, you know, people like themselves.
That's what I thought was so great about this book, is just how open Melville was to their culture.
Yeah.
Like, he did, you know, oftentimes when I like read, you know, I mean, and I'm not like a guru on literature. So, but when I do look at it, like, so often are native people depicted as savages, and there's so many scenes of touching beauty and understanding between the two worlds in this text.
Yeah, I mean, that is the extraordinary thing, because it does show the superiority and the moral superiority of these peoples and their culture in many chapters. I mean, there's sort of a mixed estimation by the end of it, but most of the chapters are very favorable. In fact, Melville uses the Typee and the Marquesan peoples as a club to beat up European and American, you know, civilization. I mean, it's this eternal debate whether civilization is worth it or not. I mean, very much in a sort of Rousseau-ist type vein, but there's some really savage condemnation of the defects of American or European culture that he that are really Swiftian in their emphatic nature. And he, you know, in fact, he read Swift, and he was definitely using some Swiftian devices to Swiftian ironies to show up the deficiencies of Western culture. Because remember, when I mean, the whole reason he went to sea was because, you know, he was down on his luck. His family had lost all their money. The country went into a deep depression in 1837 for about 6 years. So from 1837 to about 1843, there was a real economic trough for the whole country, and a lot of people were out of work. And so young, you know, fairly well-educated men like Melville, I mean, he didn't have formal education, but he's very well read, you know, forced him to go to sea. And he saw his mother in terrible straits trying to survive with, you know, 7 children after her death of her husband in 1832, and just the desperate plight that he faced trying to make a living as a young man, trying to help support his mother. All of this, I think, contributed to his attack on the Western society and everything that's being centered on money, and the fact that an economic depression can just ruin everything. But these Typee people, they're just living off the land, and they have a very just society without formal laws, and, you know, they have a sort of formal sense of morality within them, and you don't see beggars and poor people and misery and stuff, that kind of thing.
Right. So, you know what else was great about learning about this book is that it paired really well with Aldous Huxley's Brave New World.
Yeah.
Because one of the main characters, but right, like John, one of the main characters in there, clashes with what like this dystopian Western world, and it was just a nice touchstone to be able to read and teach those books simultaneously.
Yeah.
So did you ever answer my question about what percentage of the book is real?
Well,
and how we're to classify it, or is it uncategorizable?
I think, I mean, like a lot of Melville's writing, it's mixes genres, but I think first of all, it's a travel narrative with fictional elements that I would say make up about maybe a third of the book. I'd say 2/3 is based on fact, and it has. I mean, it's a romance. Romance is the name of fiction at the time that involved sort of imaginative exaggeration sometimes. It's an adventure narrative. So I don't know. It's really sort of an amalgamation.
Yeah.
Of all you can say is that it's a narrative. Travel narrative cum pseudo work of fiction.
I wonder, did Melville himself ever disclose? I mean, did he ever?
No, he didn't. That's the mystery, because one of the problems with the fact that Melville didn't get any real biography until after he was dead. No one was there to really interview him about this, and people sort of, when they read Typee, they romanticized and they assumed it was all fact, so they didn't question anything. But I think his wife, after his death, or at some point, Elizabeth Melville said that Melville never was that worried that he was going to be eaten by cannibals. I mean, these people were, probably cannibals, but he may have elaborated it so that he was more of a captain than he really was. Yeah, he only spent a month in the Typee Valley, if that's where he was. He makes it 4 months in the narrative.
Right.
But we know for sure that he left the ship in early July and he got onto another ship in the beginning of August, 1842.
Well, that raises the interesting question. So, I mean, was there really cannibalism going on here? I mean, you say he wasn't that worried about it, but there was still the possibility of it. And, I'm super fascinated. I study a lot of ancient texts, a lot of ancient cultures and stuff like that with this sort of period of self-discovery that I'm going through, and you start to notice these patterns. What did cannibalism, if it existed, what did it mean to these people?
Well, as Melville, Tomo, I should say, as he explains in Typee, yes, they did practice cannibalism on the bodies of enemies, right, as a way of adjusting their spirit, their power. So I don't think there's any hard evidence of cannibalism amongst the Marquesa, but they had the reputation for it. Just like the Fiji Islanders, the Fijis were the most famous cannibals. There's no doubt that they practiced cannibalism. The Maoris, I think, also there is more evidence that they practiced it as well. So, I mean, there's all kinds of controversies today in anthropology about how extensive cannibalism was, whether it really existed, but I think there's no doubt that it did exist, and it was not, I mean, it was always on enemies, and it's done in a very limited manner, so that it's kind of interesting, because Melville in the book, he tends to sort of justify their cannibalism by saying, Western societies have done much worse by the treatment of criminals who were, used to be torn apart, drawn and quartered, and so the savagery of the Europeans equals or is worse than these people for these minor acts of eating people. But on the other hand, he uses cannibalism as a motif to express his horror with this aspect to the Typee society. But it's part of his fear of being tattooed as well, because really the first reason he wants to leave, desperately wants to leave, is they want to tattoo him. They want to mark him as one of their own. And then it's after he sees the remains of the cannibal feast that he decides he has to get out of there immediately. So he uses. So interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's always so interesting to me that Westerners use the whole cannibalism thing as a way to assert some sort of moral superiority.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It's built in religious traditions. Right? Like
the communion.
You can make the case that, I was going to say, you can make the case that transubstantiation is a form of cannibalism, right?
Yeah.
So I know it's a different sort of thing, but it's I don't know if it's as foreign as we think it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway,
well, it's a old tradition, and I read an interesting book about cannibalism in nature, and it's all over the place. I mean, all kinds of species eat their young, or they eat, females eat the male after intercourse, like praying mantises, mate, and then the female chews off the head of the guy who's the male who's on top. So it's all over the natural world. And so, so I don't know. I'm not justifying it, but it is. It's been a long associated with human history for a long time.
Most definitely. Definitely. So, what about, how does the Christian myth of the fall from paradise map onto the novel?
Yeah. Well, that interests me in particular. I'm fascinated by Melville's use of religious symbolism and myth. And as it happens, I actually wrote an article about this, which I'll just summarize briefly. The article was called Typee and the Myth of Paradise.
Where can we find this article?
Well, I have it right here. It's in this volume of Critical Insights. It's part of a collection of Melville articles focused on. Well, it's Salem Press, and it's from 2013. And it's a series called Critical Insights Herman Melville, and they've published other volumes on Critical Insights Moby Dick, Critical Insights on Billy Budd, and I've had essays in those two volumes too. So briefly, what I'm arguing is that Melville uses the story of the fall, the myth of paradise, from the first chapters of Genesis, Genesis 2, 3, 4, or 2 and 3 basically. The myth of the creation of paradise and then the fall of man and the beginning of original sin. So Typee is really a rehearsing of that mythical material in a multiple set of ways, because first of all, when Tomo and Toby discover the Typee Valley, there's all kinds of allusions to paradise and Eden and the ease with which they can eat, and the fact that there's no real work to do, they don't have to sweat. So it's a pre-lapsarian version of paradise. Here they've come to the most beautiful place. All the people are beautiful. There's sex without guilt. It's clear that the young women are, available for him. We don't have any record of him having any kind of.
I love your use of prelapsarian, by the way.
Yeah.
Although I would correct it. I would say it should be anti-lapsarian.
Anti-lapsarian, yeah.
Because I think prelapsarian has to do with predestination.
Well, that's the term that's used most of the time, but anti-lapsarian is fine. But he also depicts his arrival there as reenacting the fall, because he himself, even though he forswears all the oppressions of Western society, sympathizes with the Typees, he hates the fact that Westerners have ruined the cultures of Tahiti and Hawaii, the Sandwich Islands as they're called, because they brought these missionaries who have sort of degraded the people, and they brought venereal disease from the sailors. So he is happy that the Typee seem immune to that, but then his departure from the island actually reenacts a kind of fall, because he seems to be killing this chief Moe who is swimming out to keep him captive, right? He has to take a life by stabbing the guy with a boat hook to keep him from keeping the boat from escaping to get Tomo out of the valley. And so it's a reenactment of the fall that's kind of inadvertent. In spite of all of Tomo's desires, he himself seems to be inflicting a sort of the same kind of harm on their culture that Westerners have brought to them, like Captain Porter. He describes this visit during the War of 1812 by an American captain who devastated the valley with fire and destruction while he was in the process of hunting down British whaling ships as part of the fight against England in the War of 1812. Some of the other aspects, though, are that he recognizes that this is paradise. It's a perfect society, but at the same time, he comes to the conclusion that there's no challenge for the Typee people, so they are perpetual children. So in a way, it's a critique of paradise, because there's no real maturation possible in this culture, and all they do is play games. And I mean, their work is, whatever work they do is always done with this sort of very hilarious spirit, but they don't have any challenges to make them develop as people. They play when he plays the game of this pop gun war that he reenacts with them. It's like a child's game of shooting these little, I don't know what the objects are, but it's a game that he plays. So it's a critique of paradise, even though it's a praise of the culture too.
Right.
And
because we're all trying to get back to that to some extent, right?
But then he gets back to it in a sense. He gets back to it, and then he says that it's a children's, it's like a kindergarten. They're all just playing around all the time, and it's at first it's enchanting, and wonderful. I mean, he has all kinds of praise for the culture, but then, of course, he doesn't feel like he belongs there. Well, they want to make him one of their people by tattooing him, and that's when he realizes he has to get out of there. So the myth of the fall operates on multiple levels, but I think the strongest one is that it's a critique of Western culture, saying that it really doesn't have to be this way. It's the myth of the noble savage, because Melville is very much in the camp of Rousseau and others who are decrying the corruption of native peoples through the expansion of American power and British power and French power. The imperialist impulse that was active in Polynesia at this time, because obviously the book begins with the French in the harbor there as his whale ship arrives, and then so the French and the British were contesting for colonial domination of the Marquesas and Tahiti and the Sandwich Islands during this whole period in the mid-19th century.
There are a couple of things I wanted to add to this. If anyone's interested, Simone de Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity, that sort of interpretive lens for this particular issue, I think would be super helpful, because she talks about this notion of metaphysical privilege, which seems to be talking about this perpetual state of 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 being a juvenile that the Typee people seem to exhibit in some way. And I had to go back and check because I wanted to be sure. Both anti-lapsarian and pre-lapsarian are acceptable. Are acceptable. And in fact, I have to apologize to you. I think pre-lapsarian is even more appropriate because it has two meanings, whereas pre-lapsarian has just one.
Okay.
So you were right and I was wrong.
That's fine. I'm just not. I'm not familiar. I may have heard anti-lapsarian, but most of the literature books I read or whatever I've read about the subject uses pre.
I was being snooty. I was investigating some Puritan theology, and I was throwing those words around the other day.
It's amazing how much theologians have dwelt on this in the past. The Puritans, I mean, they would have all kinds of terminology to determine these factors. I mean, how that was the big issue for the end of Calvinism, the Unitarianism. You know, how much do we inherit the sin of Adam? I mean, are we lineal descendants of that? Can it somehow affect us today? And
there's some of the other terminology that I learned for that was like infralapsarian and
there's all kinds of
supralapsarian. And also Kierkegaard takes up this issue in the concept of anxiety. So if you're interested in looking at it from an existential point of view, he's pretty preoccupied with it there.
Yeah.
So would you like to say more about the concept of the fall in Typee, or should we move on?
I mean, I've pretty much summarized what I need to say. If I think of something else, I'll just throw it in.
I was hoping you could comment on some of the characterizations of the native characters in the narrative. Yeah,
well, actually, let me just say, as far as the myth of the fall goes, it's interesting because Tomo's fall comes from his sight of the cannibal remains, which is kind of like the original sin of the Typees. Even though they're living in paradise, there are no snakes in the valley. He makes a point of saying that. So the cannibalism is sort of the little secret evil that slipped in somehow.
That was their bite.
That was their bite. Yeah, they weren't eating an apple. They were eating their enemy.
Man.
That's the thing that drives him out of there, the discovery of their evil, which makes him perpetuate more evil on them because of their inability to let him go. I mean, they've really become bonded with him because he's such a rarity as a white person in their valley that they want to make him one of their own. They want him to integrate with the people there. So yeah, it's interesting because the characters that you get to know most are the chief Nehevi and the honorary family he lives with, Marheyo and Tinor, and then Kori is sort of his bearer and his brother. And then there's, of course, Faye, who is the perfect young lady who is his companion, and it's almost like you don't know whether they're friends or they're boyfriend, girlfriend. But one of the things Melville does to make it more realistic is that he often compares, in a comic way, some of the actions and attitudes of the Typee people to traditional Western societies and some of the silliness of upper class society and culture. So he sort of humanizes these people by comparing them to like Broadway bucks or fastidious society women or whatever, by making these odd comparisons that ring true when you read them in the narrative. So you have these other characters who emerge with distinct personalities. I mean, not that much of the book describes this. They're sort of type characters, but they have distinct personalities. And of course, his companion Toby is an amusing sort of sidekick. You know, the two of them launch out to find the Typee Valley after leaving their whaling ship. And of course, this is based on a guy named Toby Green, who was actually with Melville on his ship when they left and climbed into the valley, into the mountains to escape. And Toby's he's a picaresque character, because he and the narrator have an amusing experience climbing over the mountains to find a place to stay away from their ship that is going to have to sail without them after, I think, what is it, about 10 days. So Toby, he was a real life character that Melville, later on met up with after the book was published. He's a semi-fictionalized character. Tomo or Melville is recreating the conversations he had with Toby, but they're pretty much based on what seems to have happened at the time. But the character that most readers remembered was Faye, because
right,
she is idealized, she's beautiful, and they spend time together, and there's the famous scene where they get into a canoe, and she takes off of her sort of wrap and holds it up as a sail, and she's there naked, using her cloth robe as a sail, and people were just carried away by the romance of this character, and there were all kinds of questions about whether Melville actually had a native girl as a girlfriend, and whether he left a child behind. There was some person who was spreading rumors later on that Melville had an illegitimate child he left behind, which I think is total ridiculous. But we don't really know what he did with the native women there. But their religion, the Marquesa religion, is an amazingly sexualized religion. So their idea of worshiping God is pretty much having sex. In the book it talks about how Typean women have two husbands at least, and there's sort of polygamy, but the women have the multiple spouses.
Interesting.
Because they're more men than women. So, but what he doesn't say is that there was lots of sex going on amongst the Typee people and the Marquesas people. So that's why in the beginning of the novel, when all the women, or the narrative I should say, all the young women swim out to their boats to greet them as they come into the bay there, and then they have a big sort of celebration orgy that the narrator decries as a horrible, immoral collapse of restraints. This is based on what would actually happen for a while before the local people realized that this was just spreading more and more venereal disease around these areas. So there's an interesting book on Marquesa religion by a guy named Robert C. Suggs, who is an anthropologist. He was writing the book, I think, in the 1950s, and he wrote. He was actually probably the best known anthropologist on Marquesan culture. I think he's still alive. He was living in Boise, Idaho. So Robert C. Suggs, because a few years ago there was a volume, a literary journal did a volume on Typee, and he was one of the contributors, and they were talking about the realistic aspects of Typee, and what people have discovered is the journey that is described by Tomo and Toby through the mountains into the Typee Valley is not at all what you find on the island that you find today, right? It was a much shorter journey because he takes like 5 days to get to the Typee Valley. He's really drawing it out. I mean, that's definitely fictionalized. It would take, I think, half a day to go from where he was allegedly to what was allegedly the Typee Valley. So it was not a very long of a walk. But instead, he's making it into kind of a mythical journey into the mountains where they go through all sorts of hardships, and he gets sick, and he gets a kind of fever. Anyway.
Yeah, I just wanted to add right here that I found an image that A. Burnham Shute did.
An image of what? Of Faye with their sail?
Yeah, it is quite. Yeah, it's quite steamy.
Yeah, that was the most famous image in the book, and people after that constantly talked about Faye. I mean, readers of the book were totally enamored. And when Melville finally got married in 1847, they said, "Oh my God, who could marry this? Elizabeth Shaw, the staid daughter of the Chief Justice of Massachusetts, who had a romance with Faye." I mean, they couldn't believe that Melville would settle for this. But her name kept coming up over and over.
It looks like a proto pinup girl.
Yeah. Of course, the name is totally invented. Faye means fairy, so she was, the fairy who's away from reality, away from home, or whatever.
Gotcha. Now, did you want to add anything about this note about Toby in the second edition of the novel, or did you cover that already?
Well, I'll just say that Toby, Melville really didn't know what happened to Toby. The story is more or less true. He got out of the Typee Valley and wasn't able to get back. He tried to convince the guy who helped him to escape to go back, but the guy was really just interested in getting money to turn him over to a whaling captain. And so when Typee came out in the spring of 1846, it got a fair amount of publicity, and Toby Green, the original Toby, was living up in Albany at that point he was in Buffalo. He was a sign painter, and he wrote to Melville and said, "Hey, I'm alive. Let's get together." So he went down to New York, and he and Melville met up and talked, and then Melville wrote the note, like a 10-page note describing what happened to Toby as a kind of supplement to the second edition of Typee, which actually was also expurgated, because the edition that we read today is mainly the original British edition, as Melville wrote it, with the story of Toby tacked onto it, even though it wasn't in that edition. But we keep the original text because it has the most explicit critiques of the ministry and the missionaries, because there are a lot of scathing things said about what the missionaries have done to people and the native peoples in the Sandwich Islands and in Tahiti, and this didn't go over well with the missionary and the religious press. When the book was published, it got pretty harsh reviews from that sector of the publication world, because religious publications were very extensive in 1846 when the book came out. There were all kinds of, each denomination had a magazine, Baptist, Presbyterians, Methodists. Actually, Methodists were the most up and coming sects, were the Baptists and Methodists. So Congregationalists. Anyway, they did not appreciate having Melville critiquing their efforts, because that was a focus for Christianity at the time, you know, converting all these native peoples, because it was in the New Testament, you go out and you spread the word. And it's just that Melville had been there and seen what happened when this took place, and how the people were sort of barbarized by conversion and taken advantage of, and they kind of lost their native cultures, and they didn't really gain anything with the arrival of these missionaries and their, you know, the businessmen and the whaling industry that used, say, the Sandwich Islands as a base. So
did it get any positive?
Yeah, well, actually, most of the reviews were positive. I mean, most of the non-religious publications,
Right.
and some of them were quite ecstatic. I mean, people loved the book, and I mean, it was Melville's most popular book throughout most of his lifetime. I mean, people just loved it, and they couldn't accept the fact that, you know, it was just one book of many. I mean, because it was so fresh and engaging and entertaining. And so it, you know, it was not as challenging as his later fiction. And as I said, it was like a captivity narrative that they had been reading for the last 150 years. And so it's, you know, most of the reviews were positive, and people, Hawthorne reviewed it up in Salem, gave it a nice review. Whitman read it and loved it, and reviewed it, and a very brief review. And so it really made a splash, and enabled Melville to establish himself as a writer, because he really had no idea what he was going to do professionally, I think, after he got back from his whaling voyages, and then his final voyage on the United States as a, you know, a warship. He sailed from Hawaii or the Sandwich Islands over the space of about a year back to Boston, and then he got out in October 1844, and he just sat down and started writing, and that was that was his launch as a writer. Of course, he was pretty well connected with his family, and his brother Gansevoort knew some people in New York by that point, and he was helped out by Washington Irving reading it in London. So on the strength of that novel, you know, he went ahead and wrote a sequel called Omu, which is a more traditional novelistic narrative about his time in the Tahiti, and it's a really wonderful book. Very funny. It's actually Melville's funniest novel. Very entertaining. If you read Omu, it's just a joy to read, because it's so amusing. It does have some more criticism of religious missionaries in Tahiti, but it has a wonderful companion. The kind of Toby character is a doctor who is sort of, you know, humorous character, and the two of them go roving around Tahiti trying to scrounge a living, and so that recounts the experiences that he had after he left the Marquesa Islands. He took a whaling voyage, and he ended up in Tahiti.
Did anyone try to do productions of either of these books? Because I mean, I'm just as we're talking about it here, I'm thinking about
movie.
Yeah, how great they would be as a movie or a theatrical performance.
I'm not aware of it. There have been documentaries. Yeah, Omu would make a funny book. I mean, a movie, but
funny play.
Well, Typee. The people.
I mean, I could see Typee. I could see Typee being a movie, definitely.
Yeah.
Don't you think?
Yeah, certainly with the the drama. I mean, there's certainly enough
Yeah.
action in the beginning and end, and yeah, there have been documentaries about visiting the Marquesa Islands. I mean, it's always fascinating to see what the islands look like now. Of course, they're a French possession, and they're mainly given over to you know, harvesting coconuts and some other, you know, products of the region. But
You've told me a little bit about how it fits into his authorship. I mean,
yeah.
What about for you personally? I mean, how does this rank for you? Because I thoroughly enjoyed it. I mean, I'd say it's in the top third of the books that we've covered.
Yeah.
Up here for me personally. I mean, I put it up there with Moby Dick and Pierre and.
Yeah. Well,
you know, I thought it was one of the better ones.
I mean, it is a wonderful book. It's got a charm to it that is, but it's just a function of Melville's style. He's such a wonderfully fluent and humorous and ironic and honest writer. I mean, when I read it this time, I was more sort of taken with the anthropological interest that the book has. How it's really creating a sort of huge database for everything you want to know about these peoples. And but then again, unlike some other anthropologists, he freely admits his ignorance. I mean, Typee and religion really baffles him. I mean, we get some suggestions about what the functions of these different idols are, but it's he's constantly saying, I really didn't know what to make of this, and no one would tell me.
So you have to be initiated.
Well, he doesn't know the language. I mean, he tries to talk to Corey, his companion, a lot about, you know, the sacred groves they go into, or the meaning of this, or whatever. But he thinks that even Corey doesn't know. So it sort of gives you a sense of the antiquity behind this primitive society, that this sort of reminder that human cultures go back and back and back, farther and farther, and you don't know where they come from. So anyway.
Well, I found it to be a fascinating book, and it just helped clarify a lot of issues in my own research. And I want to thank you very much for having this conversation today with us about this.
Yeah.
Would you like to say anything else in closing? I mean, I thought it was a fine book, and I thought you clarified so much in our discussion.
Yeah. Well, it's just the point is to just go out and read it, see how it fits into Melville's oeuvre, and I think, in a way, Melville, he made his reputation with his book, but then it became a kind of albatross for him, because
really
later on people kept saying, well, why don't you write another Typee? It's almost like they didn't want to move on to more complicated fiction. I mean, it was just getting too complex when he was writing Moby Dick and Pierre. So Melville, he makes fun of the fact that people always associated with him with Typee. In fact, they called him Typee. That was his nickname, Melville.
Interesting.
Yeah. So he, in a way, he came almost to regret it as a book that people just got hung up on, without realizing that there was so much other, more sophisticated fiction that he produced. So it's a bit of an irony there.
Yeah, victim of his own success. It's a little like people who get hung up on like the early Beatles and just can't deal with the psychedelic stuff.
Yeah, right. Bob Dylan, when
same deal.
With his electric guitar at the Newport Folk Festival, they booed him. They booed him. They wanted Bob as a folk singer, not as a rock singer.
Didn't they riot when he went electric?
Yeah, there was. There was booing. There was booing. I don't know if there was a riot, but anyway. Yeah. So, just wanted to add that note.
That's great. That's great. I like ending on that. Well, Dr. Cook, thank you so much for imparting so much knowledge today.
Sure.
Enjoy it. And, you know, I'm going to be pretty eager to dive into more so we can talk off camera about where we go from here.
Okay.
And everybody just download the Noetic app and visit us at noetic.online. And we'll have a lot of upgrades there for you. I mean, you can start using the website and everything like that, the new version. It's going to get better and better. So, and you can help make it better. All right. Have a good evening, everybody.
Okay.